Welcome back to Jess of the North. This is a part 2 video. Last week I went over how I figured out how many seeds I'm putting in my garden plan. This week's video is how I decide when I'm starting all of those seeds, because I have 4 containers about this size and it's a lot to manage. So the best way that I have found to do that is to populate it in some form of Excel sheet. I'm utilizing numbers because it comes with my Mac, so you use whatever is most convenient for you. The first thing it's important to start with is knowing your spring frost and your fall frost dates, which generally also gives you your season length. So here, I look this up every year because it does shift sometimes. My spring frost date, so the last frost date average of my coming season, is going to be May 8th. My fall frost date, again, average, is going to be the end of September, giving me a season length this time of 142 days, which is very nice because when I very first started, I had 120 growing days, so it's gone up a little bit. The other thing that I start with is common time frames that seed packets list for how many weeks before your frost you'll need to start seeds. So it's really common that these go in weeks of 2, so 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, so on and so forth. Just for easy math as far as populating into my spreadsheet, I tend to convert my weeks into how many days that is. The next thing I do is list out the names of my varieties and I group them by what they are. So I've got onions, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers. I tend to put all my nightshades together. Okra I think of as belonging to the nightshade family, and then I've got melons, squashes, cucumbers, beans, peas, cole crops. So these are your broccolis, your cabbages, your brassica family. Greens, radishes, carrots. You'll notice that these have an NA. They are not something that I start. Radishes and carrots I only direct sow. I do not start them ahead of time in the house. I do multi-sow beets. I've heard you can multi-sow radishes. If you've had good success with that, let me know. The other thing I've got here is rutabagas, herbs, and flowers. Once I have my variety names down, I will be looking at the date to maturity. And typically, particularly with something like tomatoes, your maturity date is not from when you start the seed, it is from when you transplant it outside. If it is not from when your transplant date is, it'll tell you on the packet specifically from seed to harvest this maturity date. They're usually really good about that. The other thing I want to know is how many weeks before my frost they suggest that I start. So onions tend to say 8 to 12 weeks, tomatoes are 6 to 8 weeks. Some of them don't give you a range and they're specific. My eggplant, Rosa Bianca, said 10 weeks, so I just have one date range to work with. And then I have a few of these that are a little bit strange. 3 weeks is a weird time frame for seed starting. So because for these kales and chards, it gave me a 3 to 5 week range, I just kept it with this 4-week interval right above it, made it for easy math in my spreadsheet. So if this is a process that you're looking to do in some way, this is how I set it up. Your variety, date to maturity, how many weeks you're going to need to start, and then I have my start date, which is found by taking my spring frost date minus the number of weeks that it needs me to start it ahead of time, which gives me, in the case of this David or onion, March 13th as a start date. What I also wanted to know is, based off of my final frost date, like what was the absolute latest I could start something. The end of April is going to be it for onions. I typically only do one sowing of onions, so those will be fine. One thing to note is if you are trying to keep your column and row the same and you're going to drag down in your column, you need to put little dollar signs in front of your equation, if you can see that here. For something like my tomatoes, I went with 6 weeks, so it's worth considering the space that you have. I noticed that when I got excited and I would start the soonest I could, so 12 weeks for onions, 8 weeks for tomatoes, my frost would linger, and then I would be running out of space on my seed starting shelves, and the plants catch up once they're outside anyway. So I've shifted my process so that I am starting with the latest possible time frame. So I will start onions 8 weeks before my frost. Tomatoes I'll do 6 weeks before my frost. For tomatoes that I'm putting in the greenhouse, I will start them a month sooner. I do have other things that I'm starting at the end of February. So typically, once I am going to start seeds for the month, I will pull up my garden plan that I set up last week, and I'll pull up this spreadsheet and I will look at which varieties I was planning on putting in the greenhouse, and I will bump that up a month and note that in my garden journal when I started those varieties. Eggplants, I'm only growing one variety. It's going to live in the greenhouse. This is going to be something that I start at the end of January. If I wanted to do multiple sowings of eggplant, the very last time I could do any more eggplant seeds are going to be May 1st. And the reason I know that is because I took my fall frost date, how many days to maturity, and how many weeks it needed to start seeds. Peppers, I tend to only do one sowing. Okra, I may or may not do one sowing because of how it grows. It'll just keep making branches of okra, so it's unlikely I'll need to. I've got a good 4-month window here, 3.5 months, where I could start more if I needed to. Things like melons and winter squash take the majority of my growing season. Unless it is something like summer squash with these 50 to 55 day maturity times, I'm not going to bother with a second sowing. But because both of these summer squashes are bush varieties, they will provide a crop after 50 or 55 days. So I can start some in April, I'm going to start some in May, and then the very last time I could start them is August. And it feels very strange to say I could start more squashes in August, but if you are doing summer squash, it's made to be eaten that season, not stored like winter squash. So it's possible to do, just feels weird. Cucumbers, I don't typically do a second sowing either. If I had a disease problem, it's still good to know that the latest I could start it would be July. Beans, particularly bush beans. And I noted, mostly I noted when it was a bush bean in my variety listing here. Those I will want to do multiple sowings of. So that I just did, assuming I would need to do beans every 2 weeks. And so I can take that all the way down, and it will tell me that my next sowing should be May 8th. One thing to note is you'll see that I can do my next sowing May 8th, and I've got more time before I just can't sow anymore because of the final frost date in the fall. Instead of making more columns where I say third sowing, fourth sowing, fifth sowing, I'm going to mark it in my calendar as every 2 weeks, and it'll populate that event for me, and I can end it on my calendar on this date. Because I am somebody who, if it's out of sight, out of mind, the calendar is a good prompt for me to pull out my garden journal, pull up my spreadsheet, and see what I'm starting. Pole beans I'll leave in the garden. They'll just keep going up. Peas, they're a cool season crop. I'm going to start them for the spring. This tells me when I start them for the fall. That's going to be it. That is all I need for the peas. Cole crops are similar. They are a cool season thing. So I have a spring start date and I have a fall start date. Done. I don't need to worry about any second sowings. Greens, something that has these long maturity times, anything above 90 days for me, it's not worth starting a second sowing. It might be worth knowing if I can do something in the fall, but you see something like this celery, and I've got from February to April to start seeds for celery, and that's kind of it. Something like lettuces, I'll do like I did for the beans. I can do lettuces every 2 weeks, populate it as a reoccurring every 2 weeks until this calendar date, and it's done. Radishes are a direct sowing item, but they're also cooler season usually. So again, spring date, fall date. Same thing with carrots. The carrots will hold their own pretty well as the temperatures drop in the fall. So if I start those late, they'll usually hold their own over the winter. And then beets I've got from mid-April to like the beginning of August. And so I just popped a mid-June date in here because I can tuck those into little shaded spots in the garden. I do multi-sow beets, so I put 2 to 3 seeds in a soil cell to start, and when their leaves are like 2 inches long, I transplant them out to the garden, being careful not to disturb their roots. Rutabagas, I'm gonna try, I think 3 different sowings of this. So mid-April, mid-May, end of June. And then herbs I typically leave with just the spring sowing, and I don't start them again. I mostly was just curious how late I could start some of these. And then flowers I also do just 1 sowing. That's it for the season. So the bulk of my like seed starting work is going to be in the spring, which is nice because by the time May rolls around, that's the bulk of my getting everything outside in the garden season. And then it's just the carousel of weeding over and over again. If I'm growing something like tubers, potatoes, I can order that now. Usually the companies that are shipping you potatoes are exceptionally good about shipping them when they're ready to plant in your zone, and they say that on their webpage. I ordered turmeric and ginger last season, and it did not say that they would hold the shipment until it was good to plant in my zone, and I didn't pay enough attention, and my turmeric in particular did get damaged in transit because it was too cold. So this year I'll place my order for turmeric and ginger probably at the beginning of May, so that it's able to go into my greenhouse without any damage to it in transit. Just something to be aware of if you are not starting everything from seed and you are starting some things from tubers. You're not really able to control the temperature when it's on its way to you. And unless the seller tells you that they are going to do that, be conscious of the time that you are placing your order and it being shipped to you. This has been the process that I use. If you have something similar or completely different that you found incredibly helpful, I'd like to hear from you, so leave it in the comments below. But that's all I have for you today. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Mr. Flash woke up. Mr. Flash did not want to hear about seed starting.